Welcome back to Reason and Theology, everyone. Your host, Michael, on a Friday evening. Testing to see how the connection is doing before we actually get started with the video. If y'all can maybe let me know how the video and audio is going before I get started. Maybe just post it in the chat. I know we were having a little bit of issues earlier, so what I did is restarted the router, or not router, but modem, trying to see if it's better, tolerable, where we're at. So y'all are saying it's good. Well, let's give it a few more. Let's make sure that it's coming through good. So if y'all can maybe let me know here again in about 30 seconds, just to make sure. You never know. Wanting to make sure that it's going to consistently do well. Sorry again that we are starting late, very late, in fact. Had two shows earlier on two different channels. So, those will be coming out pretty soon. I'll share them on social media when they do. But that's kind of why we're getting started a little late here. So, okay. Looks like y'all are consistently saying that it's good, still good, audio's better. Okay. So, just let me know if anything changes. Somebody's saying that the video is slightly delayed. Okay. Well, as long as it's overall acceptable, we're going to go with it. Not sure why we're having those issues. Like I said, hardwired in, don't know what's going on. Probably just something going on with the company. You never know. All right. And it could be YouTube, by the way, because I am noticing some funny stuff going on with the statistics backstage with YouTube. Some very odd things going on there. So I think it could be maybe on YouTube's end. I don't know. And I see somebody saying the video's freezing up a little bit for them. Okay. Well, again, just let me know if it gets really bad. If so, we'll just have to try it again tomorrow. But if it's doing fairly well right now, we'll go ahead and cover this. Well, I see somebody else saying video's freezing a bit. So I'll let me know here in just a second if it's getting any better. If not, probably going to just try it tomorrow. Somebody says it's fine overall. Workable. Okay. All right. Well, let's give it a shot. All right. Well, what we're doing is we're going to review a chapter from Father John Erickson in his work, The Challenge of Our Past. And it's chapter 6, Collegiality and Primacy in Orthodox Ecclesiology. It's not I'm not going to be doing a really in-depth analysis here. What I'm just going to do is pick out a few things that jumped out at me as I reread through this, because it's been a while since I've read the book, but I was rereading it, and there was a few points that jumped out at me, and I wanted to read them. And as I was trying to explain last time, it is the case that sometimes you just need to let the other side speak. You don't even have to try to refute them. You don't have to really interact. You might ask a couple questions, but sometimes you just need to let the other side speak, and the truth will stand out by contrast. So sometimes it's that obvious. And I think this is one of those cases. I could interact with this in a whole lot more detail, but what I'm going to do is mostly just read his parts and make a couple comments here and there, and I'll let his word speak for itself. And y'all will probably notice that's what I do with a lot of my guests. Some of the people that I interview, I don't really challenge them a whole lot, partly because it's an interview and you don't want to make them feel uncomfortable by turning it into a debate, but also partly because sometimes the truth stands out by contrast. You just let them talk and it becomes pretty apparent that that they don't necessarily have a handle on the truth and what they're saying. And so, but in other cases, it's necessary to come out and say something and give some interaction or perhaps give a refutation. In some cases, that is necessary. So I'm not just saying you never need to respond to people, but in some cases, you do need to just let them talk. here's one of those things that we're just gonna let Father talk. And I really appreciate Father Erickson. I think he has great work. I think he's a tremendous scholar, much better than I would ever aspire to be. And so, I mean, I'm not taking away from him there, but I think he's on the side that lacks ultimately the truth on this particular matter. So, him doing the best that he can, he can only get so far. And I'll note that he's about to set the stage and show you what the problem is. And yet, in my opinion, in this chapter, at least, he never offers the solution. And I think that's very telling because I don't think there is a solution for the Orthodox, at least. Okay. So he says, quote, so also internal needs have compelled the Orthodox to examine the meaning of primacy in the church. Now, this was written before the recent schism between Moscow and Constantinople. So this would be so much more evidently true in light of that, but he wrote this before that. This was in fact written back in 91-ish. Yeah. So a little while back, but I think it's definitely true today. So he said these internal problems and issues involved in orthodoxy that he was previously discussing, they have prompted the Orthodox to examine the meaning of primacy in the Orthodox Church. And he says, and more concretely, the role of the Patriarch of Constantinople. You could say that again, given that that's now led to yet another schism within Orthodoxy on that very matter, right? Okay, well, he goes on to, in the 19th century, Orthodox responses to Vatican I could argue that the system of autocephalous churches, utterly independent yet united in faith, was an alternative to papalism. So this concept of autonomous churches, autonomous national churches at the time, that was the Orthodox response to Vatican I papacy and ecclesiology. That's what he's saying. He goes on to say the weakness of this argument have become increasingly apparent. Like the pre-World War system of sovereign nation states on which in many respects it was modeled. Did you hear that? This view of ecclesiology isn't so much from Christ as much as it is a model of the secular society at the time, which a lot of Orthodox have no problem admitting. They have no problem admitting it. Father Erickson later on admits that explicitly, and here he's noting it as well. The system of autocephalous churches has failed to meet the demands made on it in our tragic century. Let's stop right there. That's one of those mic drop moments. That's one of those moments where just let them speak. Don't even really have to interact much with them. Just let them talk. They'll paint the picture clear enough for you. He's telling you the problem. Pretty much modern way or modern Orthodox ecclesiology, where it's at right now, isn't really sufficient to address problems in our modern time. That's why he calls the book The Challenge of Our Past. And I argue that throughout the rest of the chapter, he doesn't ever solve the issue. He leaves it open to where it really hasn't been solved at all. And I think that's very telling. He says, yet there is no consensus on alternatives. Yeah, you're right there. That's the problem. And how do we get a consensus? Well, isn't that what we're trying to determine? what how do we determine what's authoritative? Well, we need an authoritative mechanism to determine what's authoritative and identify, I should say, what's authoritative in the church. God determines what's authoritative. We need that authoritative mechanism to identify and make it clear what is the authoritative mechanism in the church that can arbitrate between two disputed facts. Well, they don't have an answer. While the Patriarch of Constantinople is acknowledged by all as first among equals, what this priority involves in the actual life of the Orthodox churches in our day is by no means clear. You could say that again in light of the current schism, because that's exactly what the schism is about. Ultimately speaking, I should say. I mean, I know there's other factors involved, but ultimately, what role does Constantinople have? The line between legitimate primacy and neo-papalism has not been drawn. The result has been a series of confrontations. What is the status of the Church of Poland, the Church of Czechoslovakia, the Paris Exarchate, the Orthodox Church in America, and then, of course, you can add to it the current schism. What is the status of the so-called diaspora in general? And who is to determine these matters? Mhm. With good reason, the latest commission charged with preparing a great and holy council of the Orthodox churches has placed the problems of autocephaly, the diaspora, and the diptychs, which is the ranking of the churches, high on the agenda. Well, yeah, back in 1991, we could say, yeah, well, we're preparing to have this holy, great, and ecumenical. No, well, they don't call it ecumenical, but you know what I mean. The holy and great council. We're preparing to have it. We've been preparing to have it for over 100 years. We're preparing to have it, and this issue, solving this issue, is high on the agenda. Well, council came and went, and it didn't solve the issue by any means. Didn't really even attempt. Very little was actually done. The real problems in Orthodoxy weren't really addressed. That should tell you something. Took over 100 years to assemble this council, and almost nothing came from it. And the big issues that needed to be addressed weren't addressed. Now, am I saying that Orthodox are not allowed to have failed councils? Of course they are. We've had failed councils too. But hey, at some point in time, we need some answers here. At some point in time, we need some solutions when it comes to the matter of authority, because unless you have that, you can't really solve any other issues, doctrinal, liturgical, juridical, whatever issue they may be. You can't solve those in the Orthodox world until you really have a consistent and objective way to identify authoritative teachings and so on. And you can't just say, well, put it all in the synod. That's not good enough. And we're seeing why. The current schism should tell you why that's not good enough. And you can't just say, well, just put it all in the hands of the local bishop. That's not good enough. And you should know by now why that's not good enough. So he sets up the stage. He shows the problems. He's hoping, hey, this council one day might address this because it's supposed to be high on the agenda. Well, it came and it went, and it took 100 years to convene this one. So I guess we have to wait another 100 years before the Orthodox are going to make another attempt at it. And even then, are they even going to be successful? I don't know. Hopefully we'll get something quicker from the Orthodox, because I think the quicker the Orthodox settle their position on authority, no matter what it is they settle on, the quicker it is they settle on that, the quicker Rome will be able to have more fruitful dialogues with it. Because you can't have a discussion with somebody about theology when they don't have an opinion yet on theology. They haven't even looked at the matter yet. They haven't really formulated an opinion. Two people who have opinions, even though they may differ, they're able to get somewhere because they both are able to explain their opinions, and they could talk about the differences and see what they could do to resolve them. But if one of them knows their view on the matter and the other one doesn't have a consistent view on the matter, you're not going to get anywhere. Okay, well, come back to me after you've studied this issue and have come to a decision, and then maybe we can get somewhere in this conversation. That's effectively how that would go, and that's effectively how our discussions with Orthodoxy is going right now. By the way, on a completely different side note, though, page 75, he does note something interesting. I just want to throw this one out. The essential unity of the local churches means the essential unity and equality of their bishops, hence episcopal consecration with its plurality of consecrators. Quote, it is not the transfer of a gift by those who possess it, but the manifestation of the fact that the same gift which they have received in the church from God has now been given to this bishop in the church, end quote. Did you hear that? For Erickson and his understanding, and he's not alone in this, his understanding of Episcopal consecration is that the bishops aren't actually giving the bishop that they're ordaining a gift. Them laying their hands on them, it's just evidence that God has ordained them. God has given them this gift. It's just kind of an odd way to put it, kind of interesting. Definitely different from our perspective on the matter. We would say God communicates that gift through the bishop, not apart from the bishop. But okay, just thought that was worth noting. Just kind of an odd view, and you'll come across this stuff when it comes to ordinations and ecclesiology. The Orthodox do not have necessarily the same views that we do when it comes to ordination. It's very interesting. So, I mean, some of them would think that okay, you're not actually a bishop anymore if you no longer have a diocese. Some would kind of take that position, whereas we would say there's a permanent mark on your soul. Once you're ordained, you'll always be a bishop. You might not have particular jurisdiction right now, but you have that gift. You have that ability, whereas some of them would argue that no, you don't have that anymore. When you don't have that diocese, you really actually don't have the ability to be a bishop at that time. There's nothing permanent on the soul, if you will. Okay, now moving on. He says, but this equality of local churches and of bishops does not mean uniformity, just as unity of essence does not exclude plurality of utterly unique hypostases. Each local church is unique, and of these, some may preside in love, using Ignatius's language. Some may more completely and perfectly express the common faith because they do not try to possess it for themselves alone, but share all that they are with the others. Kind of a straw man there. Many factors may contribute to the potential for presidency: antiquity and apostolicity of foundation, the glory of martyrdom and suffering for Christ, geopolitical advantages, size, wealth. Did you hear that? We've heard this before. I just did a show on this. The circumstantial arguments that Orthodox offer on why Rome was first in the first millennium. Well, it's because of these circumstantial arguments, its position in the empire, and it had a lot of martyrs, and it was founded by Peter and Paul, and there were a lot of good holy early popes and their orthodoxy and blah, 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 blah. All circumstantial things. None of it has to do with, well, Jesus Christ established, some kind of institution, or he gave Peter some unique prerogatives that are uniquely possessed by the successor of the Bishop of Rome. None of that. None of that. It's all circumstantial. And I showed the problem with that because all of these circumstantial arguments we can digest and accept. And yet it doesn't take away from our claim that there was a divine institution, which is there in the first millennium. Whereas they can make all these claims, but they can't accept the data of the first millennium that says it is all of those things, but it's more than that. It is also a divine institution. That is the papacy established by Christ. So we're able to account for all the data. They are not. So I did a whole video on that. So you can go and watch that. But here he is repeating that same material. But the presidency itself consists not in having any or all of these elements, but in sharing them and making the patrimony of one church, of the first church, the patrimony of all. He goes on to talk about Eucharistic ecclesiology and different views that are going on, and how some in Catholicism have embraced more of a Eucharistic ecclesiology and some Lutherans have, and blah, 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 blah. Doesn't really solve anything, but he goes into that. Moving on to page 79, he makes some additional marks or comments here. A few general observations may be made, however. First, there is little interest in what we have termed the historical argument for apostolicity, apart from some clumsy efforts to oppose the apostolicity of Constantinople, supposedly found by St. Andrew, the first called, and the elder brother of Peter, to that of Rome. For the most part, Byzantine writers reject emphatically any suggestion that apostolic authority or Petrine or Andrian authority is limited or uniquely linked to a particular see. And that's true. That's true. They don't believe that there's some kind of Petrine prerogatives and this Petrine institution that's uniquely possessed by Rome or something like that. Although, again, there's a sense in which we would say, yes, every bishop is a successor of Peter, if you will. Every bishop is Peter for their diocese. But that doesn't mean that the Bishop of Rome doesn't have a unique claim in which he is the successor of Peter and a unique kind of Peter for the Church Universal. So he's just recognizing that, hey, this is an issue that we have. I mean, we basically don't see this as unique for anyone. The Italians have made the universal teacher the bishop of one city, complains Messarites. Whereas another popular argument goes, the church is not of Paul or Apollo or of Cephas, but of Christ. Ah, what a canard. What a straw, man. Yes, we know what the New Testament says. We do have Bibles. We've read that before. We know that. That's not what we're claiming. Where is it here? Constantinople could and did call herself apostolic without any reference to the Andrew legend. A late Byzantine writer could speak of the Pope as the successor of Peter and all the apostles. Byzantine ecclesiastical literature could see the image of Peter in every faithful bishop. All this was possible in the East Apostolicity, and for that matter, Petrinity was not just a product of history. And here's the reference to every bishop being a Peter, and again, we could agree with that. A later Byzantine polemicist expresses the Eastern position with almost painful precision. Every Orthodox bishop is the vicar of Christ and the successor of the apostles. We as Catholics can believe and maintain that. So that if all the bishops of the world detach themselves from the true faith and there remains but one guardian of the true dogmas, it is in him that the faith of divine Peter will be preserved. That's where you're going to run into some problems in the first millennium, because they don't see Rome being able to fail in its unique claims to Petrine prerogatives. They don't see Rome failing in its mission, so that there would be some other bishop who's out there who would maintain the faith, and he would be the one last true Peter. So they're going to run into some problems in ecclesiology and there with the first millennium. But this is how they think. Hey, every bishop is a Peter, and if all the other bishops deny the dogmas and there's just one bishop left, he's the true Peter in the church. He's the last Peter standing. It's a pretty novel view, in my opinion. And bishops established by Peter are successors not only of Peter, but also the other apostles. Straw man. Just as the bishops established by other apostles are successors of Peter. Irrelevant. This can all be true, and yet Rome can still maintain a unique claim to being a successor of Peter with unique prerogatives that only the Bishop of Rome possesses. It's both and. He goes on to say, given this radical equality of bishops and of the local churches to which they are so intimately linked, whence arises primacy? Byzantine writers are quite explicit on this point. It is not according to a plan or arrangement of a spiritual nature that the thrones of our churches have acquired superiority or inferiority. Do you hear that? It's not because of some kind of divine institution that one see is higher, loosely speaking, than another, but according to the order of preeminence and subordination of the principalities of the world. So, if your bishop has more preeminence, I guess, than another bishop, it's because he's the bishop of a bigger city and more important city than the other. Now, again, there's a way that Catholics can actually incorporate that into their ecclesiology. We have done that. We do have distinctions between bishops and archbishops and patriarchs and popes. We do have that distinction, and so that there is some truth to that, where we can talk on that level. But we don't limit our ecclesiology to that alone. We do still claim to have a divine institution. And so we can account for the data that would have this concept in the first millennium. They can't account for the data that would speak about a divine institution in Rome. Well, maintained by Rome, I should say, the Bishop of Rome in the first millennium. They can't incorporate that. They can't digest that into their ecclesiology. So again, I think we can account for all of the data. They cannot. Preeminence is not accorded to the churches on account of the burial places of the apostles, but on account of the disposition of the holy and ecumenical councils. Well, oddly enough, some in the first millennium, yeah, did maintain this view, but did not some maintain a stronger view in the first millennium? One that would claim that it's not just canonical authority that has determined which see is above another, but weren't there popes out there and other figures who were saying, no, it's not by conciliar decrees alone, but by a divine institution? Christ saying to Peter, "You are on this rock, I'll build my church," and that being passed on to the Bishop of Rome and his successors. Weren't there people in the first millennium who were claiming that? Oh, yeah, Pope Damasus. I recall now. Yeah. Well, we did a whole video on that one. So, yeah. Let's see here. He goes on, but if primacy and other forms of church organization above the level of the local church do not belong to the essay of the church, you heard that? Primacy doesn't belong to the essay of the church. No shocker there. I mean, we already knew that Orthodox believe that, but it's just interesting to see an Orthodox actually come out and say it. Primacy doesn't belong to the essay of the church. It doesn't belong to the being of the church. It's not an essential part of the church. In other words, it's not something given to us by Christ. Did you hear that? Christ did not give us an actual order in authority. He gave us basically a headless body of bishops, effectively. A headless body of apostles. Now, of course, somebody's going to retort and say, well, Christ is the head of it. Yes, we all believe Christ is the head of the bishops. Everybody believes that. I don't know anybody who's ever denied that. The point is, everybody's claiming that Christ is in charge of their bishops. So we kind of need a visible head to make that invisible head, if you will, and his will manifest and evident, right? Because everybody can claim that, well, Jesus is the head of my church. The head of your church is a pope. Jesus is the head of my church. As if we don't believe that Jesus is the head of our church. But notice that Jesus actually didn't give us anything that's part of the essay of the church that pertains to primacy. They certainly do belong to her bene essay, though. So in other words, primacy and all this stuff, it doesn't belong to the essence of the church, but it does belong to the well-being of the church. Okay. To use the favorite expression of many these days, primacy exists for the good order of the church. The need for good order and simply the taxes, for Byzantines always viewed order as a great good. This, and not an abstract principle of conformity to civil structure, is the reason for the preeminence of subordination of sees. Interestingly, in this regard, are Byzantine discussions of the Pentarchy. The subject, so far removed from reality, gave perfect opportunity for speculation on the ideal, an ideal of harmony, coordination, mutual support, in which he that holds the first place does not boast or lord it over the second, or the second over the third. He goes on to say, a primacy of supra-episcopal jurisdictional power would necessarily presuppose the existence of a distinct and new sacramental order. We've heard this before, haven't we? This is a shot at the Catholics saying, well, you guys believe that your pope has jurisdiction over these other churches? Well, that must mean that you believe in a new sacramental order above that of the episcopate. Well, first of all, that's not accurate. It doesn't even logically follow based upon what we are saying, that it would somehow require a new sacramental order above that of the episcopate. But let's be frank here. I I find it hard for Orthodox to say that when they still don't really have really a unified view on the episcopate to begin with. I'm just saying, before you criticize the Catholics about their understanding of sacramentology, you might want to come up with a consistent view of the sacraments yourselves and the sacrament of holy orders. You might want to come up with a unified view there. And then you'd be in a position to possibly criticize the Catholics. But coming up with these straw men and then talking about an area or trying to criticize an area that you haven't really settled yourself is just kind of odd to me. So I found that part interesting. I thought I'd throw that out there. Like I said, it's sometimes you just need to let them talk and listen. Um, He goes on to say later on in the essay, the brief historical survey suggests a paradox. In the course of late antiquity and the Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic Church insisted that its primacy was due not to contingencies of politics and history, but to Christ's promise to Peter. Well, most of that is true, but I would contest this. He says, in the course of late antiquity and Middle Ages? Oh, no, 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 no. We have this claim being made before late antiquity and the Middle Ages. We have it being made way before then. More importantly, what he leaves out is that this claim is being made at the ecumenical councils, and they are not condemned as heretics for maintaining the view, those who are presenting it at the ecumenical councils. He doesn't tell you that. And I just kind of wonder, well, why not? Now, I know you can't cover everything in an essay, right? I mean, you can't speak about everything, but I do think that's important information that should have been addressed here. He says, yet the vocabulary used to describe this primacy comes more and more to be that of the principalities of this world. The Byzantine Church, on the other hand, freely acknowledged that primacies depend on the order of the principalities of this world. Did you hear that? They freely acknowledge this. I hope y'all are hearing this. Primacy is entirely on secular matters. They're the ones who govern ultimately primacy in the church. Now, again, I don't have a problem saying that some aspects to the government and the world and cities can maybe determine how important one bishop is in relation to another on kind of a middle ground area, but it can't be necessarily the case at the very top, because that would then mean that it's the world who's determining the primacy in the church, not something like a divine institution. And that's unfortunately what we see in the first millennium, where there is this claim that it's actually a divine institution that's behind this primacy, not just secular governments. So again, I don't think it's properly accounting for the data that we see there in the first millennium. He goes on to say, yet the vocabulary used for the most part sounds eminently evangelical. Once stated, this paradox may be discarded as a caricature, an oversimplification. Yeah, I would agree that is an oversimplification, but it's more than an oversimplification. I think it's also not accounting for all of the data. Yet our histories have been different. Our vocabularies have been different. Certainly, we need not be prisoners of history or of its words, as developments, particularly within the Roman Catholic Church over the last several decades, have shown. Yet as we have come to use the same words, will we mean the same thing? Will there in fact be oneness of mind so that God will be glorified through the Lord and the Holy Spirit? Much depends on how we will learn to listen both to each other and to what our histories have to say to us today. And that's how he ends the essay. And, the parts that I didn't read in between, I don't think did anything to solve the issue either. So, here we have, I mean, Father Erickson being very honest and saying that there are problems here when it comes to primacy in Orthodox understanding, and he doesn't offer any solutions. And I think it's pretty typical. And the solutions that I have seen have been very lacking. Um, but he does, say, hey, maybe this great and holy council will come out and straighten out the issues. Well, I get it. That was written in 1991, but now that the Great and Holy Council has come and done nothing, and we've had it in Orthodoxy a schism since then, major one, all over this very issue being discussed. That's not good enough. Just saying, well, maybe a Holy Council will fix this one day. That's not good enough. We need answers. I would like to see something consistent. I would like to see an objective way for Orthodox to be able to determine primacy or authority, or just some kind of objective way to determine what is true and what is not, what is Orthodox and what is heretical. That would be nice. I would like that. I would like to see that, other than subjective answers, which so far that's all I've seen. However, I have seen some pretty objective answers from the Catholic perspective. So that doesn't make the Catholic perspective right, by the way. That does not make Catholicism right. Just because we have objective ways to determine what is orthodox and what is heretical doesn't mean that we're a divine institution, that we have a divine origin, that Christ is really backing our institution. It doesn't logically follow. It could be that we just have an objective way to determine doctrine, but it's a human man-made institution. That could be. So just because the Orthodox have a subjective way to determine doctrine, and just because Catholics have an objective way to determine doctrine, doesn't make one right or wrong. But I would say one does seem to be more consistent with the data of the first millennium. Moreover, one does seem to be more reasonable than the other. Um, so that's actually why I would say that does go to support the Catholic claims. But you know what? I'd like to hear more. Um, so I hope this has been helpful to y'all. I'm going to continue to do these, interacting with Father Erickson, but not only just him, but other Eastern Orthodox. Like to hear y'all's thoughts. Of course, don't forget, as I always say, to like, subscribe, share this on your social media. Check us also out at reasonandtheology.com and go to the St. Maximus the Confessor Institute page and check out the lectures that we have on there. Also, I would ask that y'all, of course, subscribe if you haven't already, but also check us out, patreon.com/reason and theology. And that will do it. Till next time, God bless you all.